Imagine waking up in a world where cash no longer exists, where your savings aren't coins, notes, or even bank balances, but lines of code on a screen, where governments and corporations no longer lend money in the traditional sense, they lend debt itself, and it circulates endlessly. This is not science fiction. This is the hidden evolution of modern finance. A shift so profound that it rewrites the rules of wealth, power, and human choice, and most people don't even realize it. Today, we uncover how money became data and why debt has become the primary currency, reshaping the world economy, governance, and even personal freedom. To understand how we arrived here, we must go back thousands of years. In early civilizations, money was tangible. Grain, cattle, silver, and gold served as stores of value and mediums of exchange. Debt existed, but it was personal, moral, and often resettable. Kings and governments periodically canceled debt to prevent societal collapse. For centuries, the value of money was tied to something real. Gold coins, silver ingots, or agricultural goods ensured that currency had intrinsic worth. Economies were simple, you exchanged value for value, and debts were obligations to repay tangible resources. The first cracks in this system appeared when banking evolved. Medieval moneylenders and early banks began issuing receipts or promissory notes representing deposited gold. People could trade these notes instead of physical coins. This was the first step toward money as data, a promise recorded on paper rather than a tangible asset. By the 17th century, governments discovered they could borrow heavily using bonds backed not by gold, but by future taxes. The Bank of England and other early central banks pioneered a critical insight: money could be abstracted, and debt could be monetized. And here lies the first twist: money stopped being just a medium of exchange. It became a record of obligations, a ledger of promises, a network of trust that could be manipulated. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the abstraction of money. Massive trade, complex supply chains, and the growth of corporate enterprises made coins and paper notes impractical for large-scale commerce. Electronic banking, checks, and wire transfers converted money into numbers on screens. By the late 20th century, the physicality of cash was almost irrelevant for most transactions. Banks no longer moved gold, they moved data. Simultaneously, debt instruments exploded. Governments, corporations, and even individuals borrowed more than ever. Mortgages, credit cards, bonds, and derivatives transformed debt into a product that could circulate independently of money. By the 1970s, another pivotal change occurred: the end of the gold standard. Money was no longer anchored to a physical commodity. Currency became fully fiat, a government-backed promise that existed solely as data. This was the moment debt became more than an obligation. It became the only currency that mattered. Countries could borrow indefinitely, corporations could leverage endlessly, and ordinary consumers were drawn into a cycle of credit and repayment. The stage was set for a new era: money as data, debt as the primary driver of the economy. The transformation from physical money to data-based currency seemed inevitable. But it created a hidden problem. The system now relied on continuous borrowing and expansion of debt to function. Without physical constraints, money creation and debt issuance became tools of economic manipulation. Central banks could inject liquidity into markets, governments could finance deficits without immediate taxation, and corporations could borrow to sustain operations even in downturns. But here's the catch: the more debt accumulated, the more the system depended on never-ending credit expansion. Growth was no longer tied to production, innovation, or trade, it was tied to the issuance of new debt. A series of crises demonstrated the fragility of this new world. The 1980s Latin American debt crisis: countries borrowed beyond their means, yet restructuring allowed debt to persist without full repayment. The 1997 Asian financial crisis: speculative attacks exposed the dangers of leveraged economies, but international institutions stabilized the system to prevent default. The 2008 global financial crisis: trillions in subprime mortgages and derivatives collapsed, yet central banks injected unprecedented liquidity, preserving debt and financial instruments rather than eliminating them. In each case, debt was not repaid, it was rolled over, refinanced, or transformed, creating a pattern that repeats to this day. If money is data and debt is the real currency, the consequences are profound. The average citizen now experiences the system differently than a century ago. Debt serves as a tool of control. Governments and banks can shape consumer behavior, influence markets, and control access to essential resources. Economic crises become recurring. Since debt is never truly repaid, financial instability is a feature, not a bug. Wealth concentrates at the top. Institutions and financial elites profit from the creation and circulation of debt, while ordinary people bear inflation, austerity, and tax burdens. Consider modern examples. U.S. household debt exceeds $18 trillion, with consumer credit fueling daily consumption. National debt surpasses $35 trillion, yet governments continue borrowing without full repayment. Corporate debt is at record highs, often used for stock buybacks rather than investment. In essence, debt is the only currency that moves freely, while traditional money merely tracks its movement. Over the decades, governments have tried to stabilize the system. Balanced budgets, rarely successful, as debt grows faster than GDP. Debt forgiveness programs, temporary relief that rarely addresses structural dependence. Monetary tightening, raising interest rates often triggers recessions or market crashes. Quantitative easing lowers borrowing costs but encourages further leverage. Every attempt to repay or eliminate debt fails because debt has become the primary engine of the economy. The system is designed to operate on perpetual borrowing, making true repayment impossible without collapse. Today, the world operates almost entirely on digital representations of money. Cash is increasingly rare. Central banks, payment networks, and corporations track trillions of transactions in real time. Debt fuels consumption, investment, and government spending. Here are some eye-opening facts. More than 90% of the U.S. money supply exists digitally, not as physical currency. Central banks can inject trillions in liquidity instantly through digital transfers. Debt issuance now dominates economic growth metrics, from mortgages to sovereign bonds. Even cryptocurrencies, touted as alternatives to fiat, often rely on leverage and borrowing to function at scale. The system exhibits a repeating pattern: crisis, intervention, more debt, temporary stability. Every cycle reinforces the principle that debt, not money, is the true currency of modern civilization. Takeaway 1. Money is no longer a physical asset. It is a representation of trust, recorded as data. Understanding this shift is critical to understanding the modern economy. Takeaway 2. Debt has become the primary medium of exchange. Nations, corporations, and individuals are bound in a web of perpetual borrowing and refinancing, making full repayment largely impossible. Takeaway 3. Economic crises are no accident. They are byproducts of a system designed around continuous debt expansion, benefiting financial institutions while ordinary people absorb the risk. If debt is the real currency and money is merely data, the implications for society are staggering. Who truly controls the economy? How sustainable is a system built on perpetual borrowing? What happens if public confidence in the digital ledger fails? The questions are not hypothetical. The stability of modern economies depends entirely on faith in a system where repayment is optional, money is virtual, and debt dictates every transaction. At any point, confidence can falter, triggering systemic shocks. The only certainty is that debt will continue to circulate, and the consequences will ripple far beyond financial markets. If you want to explore more hidden truths about money, debt, and the digital economy, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who thinks money is just cash in their wallet, because the real story is far more powerful and far more invisible. The evolution from coins to code has already happened. The question is, will you understand the system before it shapes your future?